All right, so welcome to Catch the Flavor. My name is Alex, and we have
Janet here. And we're interviewing two of our guest speakers, Kathrin and Heather. Why don't you introduce yourselves, Kathrin?
So I work at Injured Workers Consultants, which is a community legal clinic that assists injured workers with workers' compensation claims and issues that surround workers' compensation.
And I'm Heather, and I happen to be an injured worker. And also, I'm in the unique and fortunate position of also working at Injured Worker Consultant as a co-facilitator for one of the Injured Worker Speaker School.
Okay, great. And we have an interesting story about how you got injured and then came to being somebody that works with people that went through the same thing as you did. Mm-hmm. Would you like to tell us about that?
Sure. I guess probably in 2000 is when it became very noticeable that I started to pass out. I was working at a hotel at the time, and I started just passing out, and no one could quite figure out why. And one of the things, being in the hotel, is security would come first, and they would say, well, what do you think's going on? And at the time, I'd moved into a new house, and it was like, I don't know, maybe it's the paint, and they would document all that stuff. And so when they actually realized that part of the reason why I was passing out primarily is because of multiple chemical sensitivity, they reflected back on those notes, and they said, well, you said that it was paint. So suddenly, I was the doctor back then, and I said, well, okay, actually, if you're saying that I was the doctor, I'm the doctor now, and I'm telling you this is why, this is my diagnosis, and I need help. So I went from a place of not knowing why I had the injury and being told that by the in-house doctors, well, you know, that's okay, you don't know, that's fine, we'll put you on sick leave, getting that help and that support, to finally being empowered with knowing why it is I was passing out and being told that, oh, no, we don't want anything to do with you. You have to go to WSIB. You have to figure out the claims forms. You have to figure out the system for yourself. So I was suddenly on my own. They were like, call your union, do this, do that. It was very trying, and I was very fortunate enough to come across the Injured Worker Consultant group, and
who helped you out and got the right help you needed and identified the real problem.
Yes, in some ways, because what was there for me were other groups. I went from a place of thinking that I was the only one who could possibly understand what I was going through, the only one having this problem, getting compensation, to finding out there were others like me. And one of the support groups that were there was Women of Inspiration, and it was a group of women who were mothers and daughters and aunts, and just supporting each other and recognizing how difficult it is being in the position of not only being the wage earner, and in my case I was the primary wage earner, but also having to nurture a child as well, and just take care of a household. So that was one of the groups that helped me, and also the advocates there, which Kathrin is one and can speak a bit more about her role in that.
Okay, sure. And what is it that you do at the workers? Sorry, what was it?
Injured Workers Consultants.
The Injured Workers Consultants. What is your role there again?
So I'm an injured worker advocate there. So we assist injured workers with their individual cases. Who come in who have been injured at work, but for some reason the workers' compensation system has either cut them off or has denied their claim. We assist injured workers with their particular cases, and we help them file appeals, we help them get medical evidence, we help them kind of move through the system and support them with their individual cases. But another part of the work we do, a big part of the work we do, is meaning that we do, as Heather was mentioning, the Women of Inspiration. That's a peer support group of women injured workers who come together and support each other, and they also do political action. I think it was last month we wrote a letter to the premier.
Yeah.
And so we do other things that are more kind of community building, and the clinic, the legal clinic also kind of supports and hosts the Injured Worker Speaker School, which Heather was also mentioning at the beginning, which she's helping to co-facilitate, which is basically getting injured workers to come in to learn about the compensation system and the systemic problems that are shared, and it's not just them, and they get empowered to the and they learn to speak out about their issues. So we basically do issues, we help people with their individual cases, but we also do stuff around kind of the injured worker community, and we meet with different decision makers and with injured workers, and we try to get policies and laws and the circumstances to be changed so that injured workers actually get the compensation that they deserve.
Right. And just to backtrack a little bit, so you said you got hurt, Heather, you got hurt at work from exposures to multiple chemicals, and you were sensitive to the chemicals. So what exactly was going on and like what exactly was going on, and how so did you get injured exactly?
Well, what I had noticed is that when the cleaning crew would come in, they would wear masks. And I was always asking why they wearing masks and we're not wearing masks. And first that question was internal, and then I started to voice it, only to find out years later that was the cause. That was the start of it. They were using, for instance, the cockroach sprays, and which would numb a cockroach, and I became like that cockroach. I was getting that numbing, and I would just pass out, and I couldn't move, I couldn't talk. There'd be various instances where they would have to call in the ambulance, call in the fire department, call in various people, and it was emotionally very, very hard. With every injury, there's an emotional aspect to it, and there just can't help but be a psychological part to that, and that's the part that's really frustrating, because you don't know who to talk to. And then the workplace itself, what they did is they were like, well, we can't have this anymore because this is happening to Heather. Heather won't be in today because she's sick and she's saying it's from the workplace. So the blame was suddenly put upon myself. Yeah.
I'm just curious, did any other coworkers or anybody else working at the hotel experience something similar to you?
Not as severe as myself, and just recently, I'd say about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I got in contact with one of a coworker that I'd worked with almost from the start. I had been, just to backtrack a little bit, I had been there the longest. And this particular coworker, turns out that she had similar symptoms later on. So one of the things that I found what we did have in common is, even though at the time we did not have the same symptoms, I mean, every body's body actually works differently. That now, talking to them, they're like, well, yeah, actually, I had problems. I passed out, and my doctor said something about multiple chemical sensitivity.
And so it was an invisible injury.
Yes.
In terms of, I guess it's just a word or a definition you use to call an injury that is invisible on the surface, on your body, physically. And it took you a little bit of, hustle and work to really get attention to that, because, your employer was deflecting that and ignoring the fact that it had to do with what they were doing and the workers' safety being put at risk, actually.
Yeah, exactly, because if I had lost my arm, heaven forbid, that they can see, that they would know would be in the workplace, and they can compensate for that. But because it was something that they couldn't see, they could say, no, and how do we know that you did not have that going on before? One of the things they said is that, well, you had asthma. And I was like, well, how did you know that I had asthma? There was an in-house doctor, and one of the things that I had mentioned, I said, oh, yeah, when I was little, I had asthma. So now they were putting the blame again on me. They were.
And the interesting thing is that so a lot of the workers that we see, they experience a similar situation where they're blamed for they're felt to have been blamed for the injury because they'll point to something that's in their family history or their medical history. But really, it shouldn't matter. The actual legal rules around workers' compensation is that the workplace has to be a significant contributing factor. So it doesn't have to be the only factor. It doesn't have to be the main cause. It just has to be a significant cause. So if the chemicals at the workplace were a significant cause to Heather developing, these symptoms and this condition, then it should have been compensated. And even if other people didn't experience it, even if she had asthma as a child, none of those things should matter because the workers' compensation system, as long as it's a significant contributing factor, that's enough. And it's not that. And it's much harder, as you were saying, with invisible injuries because the workers' compensation system, in order to save money, we found recently, is trying to deflect as much as they can on these pre-existing conditions, even if people are able to work. Heather, again, your asthma wasn't active since childhood, but even had it been, people are able to function and work and manage their conditions. And so if a workplace injury makes it so that you're now all of a sudden having continual problems or you're not able to work, it doesn't matter that you had some sort of pre-existing condition because you were able to function with those pre-existing conditions. And so, the workers' compensation system is we find in our work becoming a lot more difficult and stringent and putting the blame places where technically, legally, according to the, historic principles of the system and the current law, they shouldn't be. So it is a struggle, and we see that, with Heather's case and with lots of others as well, unfortunately.
Yep, they will use any bit of information that they can. At one point, it just so happens I'm an actor by trade, and they were like, but she acts, so I think that she could be making it up. And I'm just like, right, I'm making it up because I want to be carted off to the emergency. I've probably seen every emergency room in Toronto and outside of Toronto.
Wow, that seems a little extreme for them to go to that point, and quite unfair, and a little, it's rude, right? To say that you would abuse a medical system for your own,
And we find that it happens more, like I was saying, because currently, I think it's in the last 5 or so years, the president and CEO of the Workers' Compensation Board for the last 5 or 6 years, he used to come from a banking background. So he's actually more of an insurance banking type person who's really interested in the finances and in saving money. And it's turning into a lot more of a save money scheme, which ends up cutting people off unfairly because their focus is saving money, which is not the purpose of the public workers' compensation system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So say I, theoretically, it was a person who got a workplace injury much like Heather's, which was invisible, and I was noticing, these symptoms where I was feeling nauseous, dizzy, but I couldn't really identify what it was, but I had a feeling that it could have been at work from many different things at work. How would I go about getting help to identify what it is and tackling the problem?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question.
How would I do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, recording your problems that you're facing is really important. Heather will definitely, attest to that because I know that she's had problems trying to get her injury recognized. And so actually recording your issues. So for example, if you start having symptoms or passing out, it'd actually be really helpful to almost keep a little journal or diary, like note down the problems, and going to a healthcare professional and having them mark down the problems, make sure they're writing down. Because every time you go to the doctor, they do take consultation notes. They've got a chart where they write in why you came in, what's happening. So if you describe to them all your symptoms and what's happening, then they should have those kind of marked down. So if you do end up making a workers' compensation claim, all of those notes and that information will be there, and your doctor will be able to give an opinion as to whether it's related to your work. So really, the first step is to get medical attention and to try to get your healthcare professionals to try to help you identify whether work is a significant cause of the injury and to advise your employer as you're going along of what's happening. And if it's happening at work too, you could tell your coworkers. I mean, really recording what's happening so that they won't be able to say, the Workers' Compensation Board won't be able to try to say that you're making up or deflecting, or that, these symptoms, they came out of nowhere. I mean, you want to try to record it, but the most important thing is getting healthcare and getting your healthcare professionals to give you an opinion and kind of help you through, and letting your employer know as you go along.
Yeah,
Right.
tell. You have to, I can't impress upon you the importance of telling. Do not be ashamed. Just tell, document, and get the help that you need. Leave a paper trail.
Definitely, that's very important. So once I, get medical recognition that yes, indeed, it's definitely because of my workplace, and maybe treatment would cost me money. How would I go about, getting help for that? And maybe I can't afford therapy to...
Well, yeah, the workers' compensation system, so once they recognize that it's a workplace injury, and so that's unfortunately sometimes a concern, but any workplace injury, the healthcare costs that arise out of it should be covered by workers' compensation. So, that's another really important reason why you want to report all injuries, even if your employer's kind of trying to convince you not to. You should really make you should always report a workplace injury or something you think might be a workplace injury, because even if it turns out it's not, I mean, you're not losing anything by marking that, by placeholding that right into making sure that option's there for you. And if it is a workplace injury, like I said, any healthcare costs related to that workplace injury should be covered by the workers' compensation system.
Right. Just curiosity, like if I were actually in your position, Heather, and I went through all that unfair treatment and accusations, I would feel even provoked to do something as to even sue my employer. Have you tried doing that? Have you thought of that?
I have thought of that. Sometimes I wish it was available to me, but I understand the struggle in the suing system to go about doing that. But as it so happens, there was a historical compromise which does not allow for that to happen. And Kathrin, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about this?
Sure. So about 100 years ago, when the workers' compensation system was set up in Ontario, the compromise that kind of made the system come into being was that workers gave up their right to sue their employers, and in exchange, employers paid into this publicly run workers' compensation system so that they wouldn't be sued, because employers would run the risk of, if they're sued, they could go bankrupt or go under. You never know, and it becomes this big court battle, which is expensive for both sides, and it's a struggle for both sides. And so as the industrial age went on and people were getting into accidents at work, and sometimes it actually, it wasn't the fault of the employer or the worker, it's just, accidents happen in industrial workplaces. And so in order to kind of address that and to make sure that injured workers were compensated, but employers wouldn't have these massive bills and would go under with unexpected costs, they came up with this public system, which meant that workers couldn't sue and employers would pay in premiums into this system that were, predictable. And so you can't actually, if your workplace is covered by workers' compensation, then you can't actually sue your employer. You have to go through the workers' compensation system. And many workplaces that are newer aren't covered because the actual list of workplaces that are covered is listed. They were listed in the original legislation from 100 years ago. So you might imagine some technologies that weren't, invented, and office work isn't included. But any type of customer service work, any work in restaurants or stores or work sites that's manual labor, most of those workplaces are generally covered. So if you are covered by workers' compensation, you can't sue.
I see. What places are not covered usually? You said service places and restaurants are covered by?
Yeah, generally. So if you ever had a question about that, you could always call actually the Workers' Compensation Board and ask if your particular employer is covered. Yeah, and even if your particular employer is not registered with the Workers' Compensation Board, if they should be, then you're still covered. So it's if you're not sure whether your workplace is covered, you should just call the Workers' Compensation Board and they can tell you. But generally speaking, it's any industry that has physical labor is often covered, and service industry is generally covered as well. But what's not covered is some newer industries and some office work. Like if you just work in a building in an office that just does kind of office type work, often that's not covered. But again, you would always want to check just to make sure if you're not sure.
Okay. This is Alex, by the way. I just wanted to squeeze in one last question. I know we touched on sort of invisible injuries like psychological, mental, mental like depression. So what challenges do clients face in trying to get these sort of injuries recognized by workers' compensation? Like what's been happening with that so far?
That's a great question. I mean, as Heather's experience, I think, demonstrates, invisible injuries and psychological injuries fall into that category as well because they're also invisible. It's sometimes more difficult to get them recognized by the Workers' Compensation Board because there's less kind of objective physical medical evidence. They might blame, for example, for depression, they might blame other things that are happening in your life, or they might say that it's other factors that aren't work-related. But as I said before, it's a significant contributing factor test, even for psychological injuries and for things like repetitive strain injuries, which aren't necessarily invisible, but there's something that people may not think about in terms of if you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, you might get injured just from doing it over and over again, not because of a particular big accident, and those types of things should be covered as well. And with the psychological injuries, often they're also what they would call secondary injuries. So it's not that the person got a psychological injury from work itself, although that can happen. For example, you witness someone who has a horrific workplace accident and you see your coworker get mangled or something, and then all of a sudden you develop a fear of working around machinery. So that could be a psychological injury that you get from work. But more common, what we see is that you'll have a worker that gets a physical injury, and then as a result of all the things that happen, all the struggles that you face, both with the workers' compensation system and with, maybe your reduced ability to work, dealing with the stress around your family, all of the things that kind of fall out of your physical injury, you develop depression or anxiety or PTSD, and those types of psychological injuries, again, as long as they're related to the workplace injury. The workplace injury was a significant factor in developing that psychological injury. Those injuries should be covered as well, in fact.
Okay. So it seems like the big challenge is trying to prove that the invisible injury came from the workplace.
Yeah, definitely. And the big support in that should be doctors and your own healthcare professionals, both, your family doctor and other specialists that your family doctor might send you to. They should, they'll be writing reports and opinions as to whether it's connected to work, and they'll do, assessments and psychological assessments or whatever it is that they think they need medically to give you an answer and to help support your claim if they agree that it's a workplace accident. That one of the challenges that has been recently in the media, actually, is that doctors aren't, unfortunately, always listened to by the board. So the Workers' Compensation Board will make their own decisions, ignoring doctors' opinions, or they'll get their own doctors that they pay, that they hire to basically look at a file and give an opinion that they want, or that's what doctors. So there's like I said, a report that just came out in the media that was written, that was presented on behalf of the Ontario Federation of Labour and a bunch of psychologists, where they documented a bunch of instances where they weren't listened to, and they were providing recommendations and opinions about patients that were severely injured from work, and the Workers' Compensation Board just makes their own opinion even though it's against doctors' opinions. So that's also, unfortunately, a really big struggle that's currently an issue and in the media.
And to add to that, there's also in-house doctors as well. I experienced an in-house doctor. So while a doctor should be loyal to the person that they are dealing with, they're loyal to the people who employ them, and that happens to be the employer. So there's a conflict of interest. And fortunate for me, there was a body that I could go to. I went to their governing body, and I let them know that this was going on. It went in appeals, a couple of appeals, and it was decided with a neutral body. But again, it's really important that you be your own advocate. Mm-hmm. Which isn't, it's easier said than done, because you are in this pain, you're in physical and emotional pain. But if you feel that something is wrong, if something seems wrong, question it, go after it, grab any support around you that you can to help you up, to help you to achieve that.
And I'll just mention, actually, building on what Heather was saying in terms of the company doctors, just so people know, you do have a right to choose your own doctor, so you don't have to see the company doctor if you don't want to. But again, people don't necessarily know that. So
And they will make it seem like you have to.
Yeah.
You have to, and it's like, no.
Okay. That's a very important aspect of workers' comp that I guess many people should know about, and I guess the more people that know about it could like advocate together. Like, it's not something that people have to go through by themselves. And if we're in it together, then our voices will be louder, bigger, and
Definitely.
like a big significant change could be made to this.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, we're running out of time, so I don't know if Janet has anything else to ask before we go on break.
I think I don't have any more questions, but I found your story very compelling, and very sorry to hear that you had to go through all of that. And thank you, Kathrin, for sharing all about what people can do and what actually the services are offered for people that have been injured and have invisible injuries. So I think we'll sign off with you two, and thank you for coming onto our show and speaking with us.
Thanks so much
Thank
for having
you.
us.
Yes, thanks for allowing us to share.
Not a problem. Not a problem.
Agree.
All right.
I think we're going to take about a 5-minute break with some music.
Yep.
Okay.
We'll be right back.
Thank you. Bye.
Or are you the problem? Dancing in the dark. Tell me what's that all about? Everybody! We will